Hello to everyone as you come on in here. Oh, and more people emitting, yay. Thanks for making the time to join us this evening. My name is Michael. I'm the events coordinator and publicist at Annie Bloom's Books. For those of you who aren't familiar with the store, we're located in Portland, Oregon, in the heart of Multnomah Village. We've been around for 42 years now, and we are still plugging along. Our store, as of yesterday, is now open to limited browsing, just a couple of people at a time. It's first come, first serve. So if you want to be in Annie Bloom's for the first time in a year, you have to show up at the front door and hope we don't have too many people in there already. We are open on weekdays from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and weekends from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. In addition to the limited browsing, you can give us a call, order books on the website, come up to the front door and ask for a book that you know is in the store or hope is in the store, ask for advice, ask for our thoughts on books. We love to talk to people. Big thing that we've missed the most during the pandemic is just talking to people about books. So we'd love to hear from you in any fashion that you'd like to do that. You can always shop on our website, annieblooms.com, day and night. We also offer shipping and local delivery within 3 miles of the store. We have some great readings coming up. It's National Poetry Month, so we have a couple of poetry readings. On Monday, April 12th, Portland poet Kim Stafford will be launching his new collection, Singer Come From Afar. And there will be a singer-songwriter there with him. So that should be cool. On Friday, April 23rd, John Brehm will be reading from his new book, The Dharma of Poetry, which is a book about poetry. And I think he's going to be reading some poems as well. And then we have a bunch of other events in April that are coming up that you can read about on our website. Tonight, we are delighted to be hosting Jamie Yourdon for the live stream launch of his new novel, The Space Between Two Deaths. You can order that book from Annie Bloom's by clicking on this link that I'm about to, right now, put in the chat over here. It is there. So click on that, go to Annie Bloom's, order Jamie's awesome new book. We would really, really appreciate it. After the reading, there will be a Q&A session. So if you start formulating your questions as it goes along, you can also feel free to put them in the chat and I will read them from there. You can do that anytime. Let me tell you about Jamie's book, The Space Between Two Deaths. In ancient Sumeria, only a thin veil separates the living from the dead. The lives of Ziz, her mother Meshara, and her father Temen are disrupted when a mysterious crevasse, we'll call it a crevasse, rends the earth. Temen becomes obsessed with the mystery and, capturing a crow to guide him, he follows a path to the netherworld where he hopes to gain wisdom from his dead father. Yet he soon finds that ancestors don't always provide the answers we need. In his absence, a grisly accident occurs on their farm. Meshara and Ziz are forced to flee. Friendless and alone, they must find a way to survive despite the brutalities of their landlord and devotees of the religious nation state. Will the women revel in their companionship or seek to find freedom elsewhere? Jamie is a freelance editor and technical expert. Received his MFA in creative writing from the University of Arizona. His short fiction has appeared in the Alaska Quarterly Review, Underneath the Juniper Tree, and Chicago Literati, and he's contributed essays and interviews to BookTrib. His debut novel, Frolics Ladder, was published by Forest Avenue Press. Laura is in the house. Woo, Forest Avenue Press. And Jamie lives here in Portland, Oregon. Everyone, welcome. Jamie.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm not going to hear anything tonight. All that's going to be going through my head is crevasse. That's it. I'm done for the night. Also, as you were talking, I was like, this plant looks very much like a noose behind me. So between those two things, my brain is completely shot. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you, Michael, for hosting this. Thank you, Annie Bloom's. My children suggested that I thank them also tonight, but they're not here. So honestly, I just don't know what they've done to warrant it. Don't tell them, but no thanks to those two. Yeah, we're gonna kind of move forward the format that we would were we all in person, which obviously we are not, or I wouldn't be wearing pajama pants. I'm going to talk for a little bit about this book and how I came to write it. And I'm going to read even less from this book because that's the part that I dislike the least, listening to someone else read. And then hopefully, as Michael suggested, you could start kind of forming some questions from this raw data, and that could dump us into a conversation. Though conversation looks very different, I think, in this format with all of you muted. It's the kind of conversation that I really enjoy, where only I talk. This book was many years in the making. I started writing it in 2016, which I realize is 5 years ago now. Though, 2016 was a really terrible year for a lot of people, though that sounds so quaint to say at this point. Like, I think a few celebrities died, and we were like, Bowie died, and we were all really bummed about it. And then Trump got elected toward the end, and we were like, well, how bad can that fucking be? But I had just a rotten, terrible year. And in my flailing around trying to find some kind of island of calm and normalcy and what the rest of my life would look like, I spent every day kind of funneling raw pieces of myself and my psyche and my emotions into a writing project, as I so often do. And this was that writing project. There were days when I was able to manage about a sentence, and then that was it. There are days when I'd write a few pages in a row, and then I'd toss them all right after. I just didn't have any kind of continuity or emotional momentum. But as you went on, and I started to build that momentum and develop a plot and develop a story and find characters who I wanted to spend time with, I started to tell myself that everything would be okay once I was done with this book, which I realized was a self-fulfilling prophecy, simply because it could take as long as I wanted it to take to be done. I was sharing pieces of it with the writing group, which Michael actually was in, so he saw some early pieces, and my writing group would ask really annoying questions like, well, was this a polytheistic culture or a monotheistic culture? I'd be like, I don't know that. No one knows for sure. I guess I need to research. So I would have to turn around and go research ancient Sumeria and come back and be like, it's polytheistic. And actually, Michael and I were talking before we opened it up to everyone that one of the earliest reviews that The Space Between Two Deaths received was from a very angry Assyriologist, which is a thing. And she pointed out an historical inaccuracy in the first sentence of this book, which was enough that she just put it down. She's like, I'm walking away from this work of fiction in which you've made something up. But I did, and I continued to, and ultimately got a whole book out of it. And then there was a whole process of convincing people that a book about death and resurrection in ancient Iran would sell. So let's see how well I managed to win that bet. But here we are. The book exists in the world. I am so grateful that you are all here to celebrate this milestone with me. A lot of people came out with books in 2020 and early 2021 and did not have the experience they might have hoped for or might have dreamed of for a very long time. And I'm so grateful that we all know how to mute Zoom and sit still for long enough for someone to talk at you for an hour. So I'm going to read the prologue. It's very short. It's 4 pages long. We'll be at the Q&A before you know it. I don't think there's any context I need to provide other than ancient Sumeria, the book I wrote while my life is falling apart. But look, I now have a life involving shelves and plants that my therapist pointed out don't require a lot of watering. And I was like, honestly, I feel like you're crossing a boundary, and like, that's kind of judgy, Roseanne. So here we go, the prologue from The Space Between Two Deaths. The army of Nippur attacked before dawn. Scouts entered the city of Uruk through a half-dozen gates, followed soon thereafter by infantry soldiers who surged down the uneven streets. For many of the young men, it was their first military campaign, a fact reflected by their behavior. They sang songs, excoriated one another, and made horseplay. Soldiers entered houses at random, one-story mud brick structures grouped around open courtyards, where dazed Urukians soon found themselves cornered, befuddled by sleep and armed only with cooking implements. They wept and panted, they reeked of terror. Men above the age of 9 were slaughtered. Survivors would fetch a good price as slaves, even the wives and daughters who were defiled this day. Meanwhile, the Nippurians stole gifts for their loved ones and made jokes to soothe their nerves. By first light, the sky over Uruk was hazy with smoke. What little resistance the soldiers had encountered, they had gleefully quashed. As they made their way toward the central ziggurat, with its unique vantage point and terraced steps, they expected to find the worshippers of Enlil waiting for them. It was common during the summer months for one Sumerian city-state to invade another, and in doing so, to raise their temples and kill their Zagmi. On this day, however, the Nippurian soldiers would encounter something different. Inside the ziggurat, their footsteps echoed. Immense statues of Enlil gazed down at them, with devotional jars of honey placed at his sandaled feet. Below the main shrine were rooms meant for food storage, as well as a mausoleum for the city's Mitu. And it was here that the soldiers found the Zagmi and their stewards. Not a single one was still alive. They'd all ingested poison, a variety of berry that stained the tongue when chewed, but also proved to be fatal at a sufficient volume. It appeared that the worshippers of Enlil, privy to their fate, had embraced death on their own terms. In room after room, the soldiers encountered their corpses, bellies distended and tongues blackened, bowels emptied upon the floor, each face a hideous mask. For every Zagmi, they counted 4 stewards, boys with shaved heads and eyebrows, some only recently parted from their mothers, often clinging to each other in death. Perhaps the soldiers thought of their own siblings back home, or the succor of childhood they'd so recently enjoyed. Each level yielded more rooms and more bodies, their skins still warm, the silence deepening. The soldiers were distraught. They tore at their hair and swallowed their tears. This was not the natural order of things. It was their prerogative to kill the Zagmi, not the Zagmi's prerogative to kill themselves. As word of the mass suicide spread among the ranks, a greater concern surfaced, one that could be seen on every face. If the Zagmi could orchestrate their own death, what further authority was forfeit? What power had the Nippurians ultimately ceded? On this day, the army of Nippur killed everything. Every woman or child had been spared for auction, every household pet or stray animal. The soldiers became the gears of a terrible machine. They were rage and savagery. Even some of the soldiers who'd been present at the temple were murdered by their peers simply for bearing witness. Gone was their laughter from before. There was no joy taken in this reprisal. Once every dwelling had been searched and the final death toll had been tallied, the city of Uruk was incinerated to affirm the dominance of Nippur. There would be another consequence. For the first time in recorded history, more Mitu now populated the netherworld than living souls populated the natural world. The wholesale death of so many men, women, and children had tipped the scales. As a result of this imbalance, a rift occurred. The netherworld swelled to accommodate its growing ranks and to represent its newfound prominence, thus testing the boundaries of the natural world. The earth split in two. This phenomenon could be observed for miles around, far beyond the ashes of Uruk, where people of many nations would comment on the disturbance, speculate, and then resume their normal lives. And now I would bathe in your applause, and it would feel great, and I get a little bit sweaty. I see clapping. That's nice. Oh. Michael, hit me. I'm not going to read the questions because then I'm going to get really distracted by things. So I'm going to focus on the dulcet sounds of your voice.
Okay, well, someone has to type a question for me to ask it, and said, oh, here we go. Let's see. Nope, nothing yet.
It's fine. I have coffee.
And you're also welcome to unmute yourselves or raise a little blue hand if you'd like to just ask an actual question instead of typing it in.
I'll unmute.
There we go.
So, Jamie, why Sumer and not another ancient civilization? What was it that drew you to that particular history and mythology?
What an excellent question from an intelligent person who clearly got a great primary education in New York City. As the very earliest piece I had to work with. And this had everything to do with the grieving process I was going through after the death of my own father. Is I imagined a man who I thought would be my protagonist, traveling into the netherworld in an effort to retrieve his own dead father, failing to do so, returning to the natural world, but in returning, being told by everyone around him that he had been rendered dead in the process. And he would say, I'm clearly not dead, here I am. And they'd say, you are very clearly a dead person now. Because as anyone who has experienced grief in any form for any reason knows, it just pulls you out of the tide of normalcy. You watch things go by you and they know you no longer move at that pace. You are no longer among those people. So that was what I started with, and it had a very parable-like feel to it. And I think, in all honesty, what pulled me toward Sumer, aside from the vaguest of memories of studying it in, I don't even remember what grade, the internet, which is rad, provided me with an appendix of Akkadian nouns and verbs, I'm sure, but I stuck to the nouns. This is the language that was spoken in ancient Sumer. And reading down this list and kind of possessing the mouthfeel of these words that were literally foreign to me, I actually, in the nouns, found characters' names, even before I really knew the characters. Some examples would be, just because they're names that Michael dutifully read from the copy. Ziz is the name of a little girl, and Ziz means moth in ancient Akkadian. And I thought, yes, I could see this little moth. Temen is her father, and that means foundation. Meshara is her mother, and that means all the oaths. Something about the pairing of these nouns and these meanings started to give me a little bit of shape. And I think once I committed to ancient Sumer, and as I said, I was receiving very intelligent and insightful questions from a group of professional readers who were pressing me to be able to speak to the culture and the environments that I was evoking. I learned things like, I learned what rights a woman had in ancient Sumer, which actually were remarkably good. She can own property. But that fact defined these characters, defined if there's a family unit and it's broken up and a mother and daughter are left alone, what is available to that mother? Well, as a matter of fact, she could have a degree of freedom and autonomy in this culture. Hey, cool, I've chosen the right culture to write about. Or not even so much I've chosen the right culture to write about, but the culture in which I'm writing is going to shape the options that are available to my character. If I had determined that I was writing in a culture in which that was not available to her, that would have steered the story in a different direction. So, I mean, to come back to your question of why Sumer, I'm sure I've kind of kicked around a few other ideas, but some little piece, and I really think it was just getting these proper nouns and getting these names, pulled me deep enough in that I couldn't really imagine the story and these characters occupying any other time and place.
Cool. Megan Savage asks, can you talk a little bit about funneling such personal concerns / pain into fiction through a world and civilization that is so far from your own?
Can I, Megan? Yes, I can. I have often found, I've written a lot of books, and I have found that about 2/3 of the way through a first draft, I kind of recognize what I've been doing this whole time. I've had my eyes down, and I've been concerning myself with such kind of basic matters of who's going where and why do they want to do that, and I don't really have a greater grasp of the themes at play. And the themes are really the themes of my life as an artist at that time. They're the questions that I'm looking for an answer to, and can I ask these questions more broadly or Trying to find out the appropriate way to say this. 2/3 of the way through this first draft, I realized that I was writing a book about power dynamics. It caught me very much by surprise. I thought I was writing a book about grieving, and certainly there is a lot about grief in this book. But I was working on a scene in which a little boy and a little girl occupy a room together, and I was about to say something that gives away a little bit of the plot. The little girl is aware that the little boy has the power in their dynamic, simply by merit of being a boy and not a girl, but also given their families and where they are. But in this scene, the boy's mother enters the room. And as she does, she assumes the power. And the little girl recognizes this. She's like, he had the power, now she has the power. And she wonders to herself, did the little boy know that he just lost the power? Or is this something he's oblivious to because he's oblivious to when he even possesses the authority? And as I was writing this scene, I thought, oh, this whole book is about power dynamics. Now, the reason I was writing a whole book about power dynamics is because at this point in my life, I was sitting in therapy once a week and just and going through all that I had been through in my life, in which power dynamics played a very particular role. And I was able to now look back over what I've written so far in this first draft. And in every scene, I was able to say to myself, what is the power dynamic? Who possesses the power? And what are they doing to keep it? And who doesn't have the power? And what are they doing just to survive? What are they doing to make themselves visible? What are they doing to make themselves wanted or pleasurable? What are they doing just to kind of like sneak through the cracks? And each chapter all of a sudden had this tremendous clarity that I hadn't possessed. And I had to kind of rush to the end of the book so I can go all the way back to the beginning. But to answer your question about how, I think the setting, the more fantastical and distant the setting, the more I can fool myself that I'm not writing about me, which is just a lie that I manage to convince myself of like once a year. With every book that I write, I'm like, this time I'm just making shit up. And at the end, I'm like, nope, same old story. Like, Paul Auster's gonna write about the Mets every single time. Well, I'm gonna find me a 9-year-old boy to write about. But yeah, and I think the stranger the setting, the more I ask the reader to kind of bear with me as I establish, like, we're gonna have a talking crow and you have to be fine with that. It's gonna be okay. Your crow's great. The more I'm just kind of drilling into myself, the talking crow that is Jamie Yourdon. You all suspected. I'm making it public tonight.
That's your new nickname, says Megan. The Talking Crow, apparently.
That would be the kindest nickname I've ever gone by, even if it only lasts for another few minutes.
So here's my question. Where did the female characters come from if you are the crow and the other male character and searching for Temen, searching for his dead father?
Well, I thought Temen was going to be the protagonist at the beginning of all this. He was the character I most easily associated with, simply by dint of the fact that he was the guy, the patriarch of this little family. But instantaneously, as I have a small degree of objectivity and I'm watching this happen, and I know that people who don't write books find it very strange to hear someone describe it as I watch this happen, but there is this kind of distancing that takes place that even as you're putting on the page, your mind is one step ahead of you. So your characters have this sense of kind of, I'll use the word autonomy again, they have a degree of autonomy. But Temen was making a very selfish decision to pursue his father and to leave his family behind. And the moment he goes away, it puts his family at risk. Now, at the time that I was writing this, I was going through a divorce and I was going through a dissolution of a marriage. And I had tremendous guilt over the decisions that I was making that I felt were right, but did I have the right to make them? Was I handling myself gracefully? And I probably put a lot of that into Temen. And as I watched him, and I kind of asked myself, well, what responsibility does he have? And what responsibility is he just like forfeiting? I felt worst of all for his child. Like I felt worst of all for my own children. They're the ones I worried about. I didn't worry about the adults. I worried about the kids. And I worried about Ziz. I worried about this little girl. And I wanted to give her every capacity to do well and to come out okay, but without bullshitting around. She faced some real handicaps and challenges, and it would have been insincere to pretend she didn't. There was an early reader of this book who you could call a beta reader or a sensitivity reader. Essentially, an editor said, "So, what is your experience, Mr. Yourdon, with Iran?" And I was like, "Oh, no, I have none." So we found a reader who could speak to, maybe these are cultural inferences that you don't want to be making, or maybe this is not the best light to represent someone in. And I really appreciated the feedback that I got from this reader. But at the same time, one of the things this reader said was, there are no sympathetic men in this whole book. And I was like, well, I don't think there are many sympathetic characters in this book, because I think they all act honestly. They all behave as people tend to behave. But also the men in this book tend to have power by dint of the position they have in society. And if anyone wants to write a note to someone with power who handles themselves with grace and generosity on a daily basis, it would be news to me. So I didn't want to put myself through any contortions or put this plot through any contortions to make a character like Temen seem sympathetic when, frankly, he wasn't. I could have compassion for him. I could recognize why he made the decisions that he made. I could even be happy that he made these decisions for himself, but I had to take a big step back and see how it just devastated other people when he chose a path for himself for his own reasons.
A couple of questions from the audience. Someone whose name is, I think from birth, Poopy Head Stonebottom asks, do you have any plans for book touring, or what are you doing to launch this bad boy into the world to those longing for Crow Chat and others?
Well, Poopy Head, who I have book toured with, who takes up a lot of a hotel room for just, everyone needs their space, and that's fine. I'm still okay with that years later. It's a strange environment in which to promote a book. I was saying to Michael before everyone popped into being that something I have very quickly learned that I value in this kind of exchange is, as long as there's enough fuel for a conversation, as long as enough questions come through and I can kind of bullshit on for an hour to an hour and a half, we have a finite piece of art even, and then up it goes on YouTube, and it's available to people who couldn't make it tonight. Yeah, simply by dint of the fact that it's late on the East Coast. Whereas were we actually in Annie Bloom's, which is a lovely place to read, and they have a really nice cat, it is performance art in a sense, and it's done as soon as it's done. And it's, everyone has their experience, and maybe you took some pictures, but that's that. I really dig the fact that I did something in New Jersey a couple of weeks ago. I'm doing something in Montana a couple of weeks from now. I could be everywhere, baby. I could be everywhere at once. Again, in really comfortable pajama bottoms that came today. And once they put them on, I was like, I'm not taking these off ever. So I will pursue as many opportunities as are available, though at the same time, independent bookstores are finding that it's really difficult to host something like this for anything that comes along. It doesn't take bandwidth in the literal definition of the word. We're all on our internet, but it does take a really committed, not everyone wants to spend their Tuesday nights, listening to this. So we all kind of plunged into it in April or May of last year. And by now, we have as much interest as our children being on Zoom, which again, thank you so much. You especially, Poopy Head. Glad to see you.
Another person from our former writing group, Cody Luff, asks, can you speak to the use of violence as both motivator and an interesting type of metaphoric punctuation in this story? Is it used to help define the characters or defy them? Wow.
I know, that Cody Luff guy. He just falls out of bed into a beautifully crafted sentence. There's a guy I went to grad school with who would talk about how much he loved the punctuation of violence in a short story. And his stories were all set in Polish neighborhoods in Chicago. And so his violence was like a cinder block thrown off a third-story building onto a Firebird. But yeah, I know, it's really cool. It's a great story. And I remember he would talk about it. And then, so finally I wrote a story where at the end of the story, someone slapped someone else. And I didn't even really know how to write it because I'd never done it before. But I remember thinking like, wow, that really does, punctuation is a fantastic word for it. And with this book, one of the earliest readers who I know well, who could kind of speak back to me, was just like, ooh, I just read something really gruesome. I was like, you did in my book? Like what? What, honey, what is it? And she said like, a finger got cut off. I was like, oh, yes, like a finger does get cut off, but I want to assure you that's as bad as it gets. Don't even worry about it. And then a little later, she's like, and I think a penis just got cut off. I was like, oh, right. That does happen too. But I'm 100% sure, she's like, before you finish that sentence, someone's eyeball? And I was like, oh, right. Oh my God, who wrote this book? What sicko put this on the page? There is a shocking amount of violence in this book. It's really dark. Someone who read Frolick's Ladder and knows nothing else and jumped into it, and they're like, wee, is going to have nightmares for the rest of the year. I don't know that I could speak to why I made that decision. I could say that it's not something I normally do. So it felt organic and appropriate to this story. I think a lot of it had to do with, metaphor. I had one reviewer who made a very interesting observation that there's a lot of ingesting in this plot. A lot of characters are taking things into their mouths, into their bodies. Sometimes it's food, sometimes it's part of someone. So when I read someone was like, oh, like trigger warning, there's cannibalism. I was like, what is this book with cannibalism? Like, when did I black out and write a book? And can I do that on a more regular basis? But I find myself in a dark alley of this answer. I don't know. I don't know, other than to say that the grisliness that accompanies these mortifications I've described felt genuine. It felt like, if nothing else, it was establishing the stakes, because we have characters who go to the beyond, who go to the netherworld and come back. And in the netherworld, there are body parts everywhere. So, and I should just like, it's a rare paragraph where you're not dealing with dismemberment. But I wanted to be very physical and literal with what happens to bodies in this piece, because there's plenty of symbolic violence that takes place. And I think a book that is too heavy on symbolic violence and has no stomach for actual graphic violence is kind of pussyfooting around. And I wanted to be a little bit more honest about what I was writing. That's such a good question, Cody. I just totally screwed the pooch, but thank you for asking it.
I thought it was a good answer. Other folks? Questions.
What you working on now?
At the moment, it's funny. The book I'm writing right now feels very much like a response to deaths, which is amusing to me because a number of books have been written in between. So, I always find it so funny when you'd see actors being interviewed about a movie, and I'd be like, "What's it like to work with Matt Damon?" And be like, "Oh, he's hilarious. I love him." But you realize that they hadn't actually hung out with each other for 5 years. This movie was filmed so long ago, and they spent 3 weeks together, but they were asked to speak about it like it happened in real time. I have written 2.5, three books since this, 4 books since this one. So that I'm writing one now that speaks to this. It's kind of like crossing a great divide. The current setting for the current book is 1899 Appalachia, and it's about a Scottish priest who shows up in West Virginia, and he is trying to find where his dead father has been buried. And he is very reticent to tell anyone who his dead father is, which makes it difficult to find the grave. And he enters a culture that is very reticent to share any information, let alone to somebody who is not sharing much about himself. But I really, there's no talking crow in this one. There's a donkey named Aristotle, and he hasn't talked yet. And the only reason I make characters talk in my book is because it annoys my agent so much. So I've done that a few times. I don't know. I'll have to find new ways to annoy her. But Two Deaths was really an examination of like when things get as bad as they can get, like when all hope is lost, what do we do? Because when all hope is lost, you still wake up the next day and there you are. This book seems to be asking questions. I'm not far enough in to really know. It has yet to reveal itself to me, but it seems to be asking the question, how did things get so bad? It seems very much to be about making meaning, and the stories we tell ourselves, not even in the hopes of comforting ourselves, but just to make sense of things. Anyone who's spent time with children knows that they are remarkably good at imagining the answers to unknown questions like, why are you crying? They're so good at coming up with reasons, and the reasons are always 100% wrong. And if you don't correct them, they just build upon those reasons and off it goes. So you need to like have the wherewithal to say, the reason I'm crying right now is blah, 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 even though you don't want to, because they'll be like, it's cool, it's cool, it's cool. You don't have to tell me anything. I know you're crying because you're sad that I didn't eat all of my food and I'm a terrible person and now I'm gonna have an eating disorder. And in this current plot, I have a Scottish priest who shows up, and everything that's been done has been done. And all the stories that have brought the characters to this place have transpired, and they're at the end. And this is very much a story about, and Sam, I'm sharing this for you, it's very much about beginnings, middles, and ends. And where are you in a story? Are you in the beginning? Are you in the middle? And are you in the end? It makes a lot of use of creation myths. It really relies very heavily upon, the Scottish priest. He really wants this to be a Judeo-Christian creation myth, and so he's not very interested in the myths that come from the Philippines. But the story of Noah's Ark, like this story, it's a beginning and it's a middle and it's an end. The story is like the crux of so much, and that is where these characters find themselves. But some believe that they are at an end. They're in 1899. They think the world's over. That's it. Some believe that they are just the beginning. And if you can't share a story with people around you, if you can't share a narrative, this great disharmony takes place. I don't know if disharmony is a word. But so that's like after 140 pages, that's where I find myself. Though happily, one of those other finished books is the book that we are currently off trying to sell to publishers. So I don't have to worry about this one so much because that one's doing the yeoman's work for me.
Probably your agent is doing all the work because she wants to know, why do you think it's appropriate to annoy your agent? You understand she's your boss, don't you?
It's
And
really because
follow-up,
it's
what
like the
makes you love
easiest
your
thing I
agent so
can.
much?
I'd like everyone to know that I put a talking dog in a book only because I wanted to annoy my agent. But once you have a talking dog, the dog says things, and then you have to like that character becomes super important. You can't have a dog just be like, "Hey man, I talk," and then you'd never come back to that again. So it you know, well, I move furniture around in order to annoy you, Beth.
Kate Joseph has a question. You mentioned grief as context. Are you able to articulate how actions and events in the book relate to grief? Is grief the strongly underlying theme? As two options, is the book portraying how grief is experienced, or was it more of an outlet for your grief?
That's a great question, and I actually really appreciate how you hold it up and kind of look at it from a lot of different directions. I think if we take a more literal understanding of the word grief, of the meaning of the word grief, you know, there are certain words that in our culture we have just learned to only know them to mean one thing. If you talk about trauma, to I was gonna say to an American, but maybe any modern person, talk about trauma, they basically accept that you're talking about like rape, murder, soldiers, maybe a bad car accident. Trauma is not accepted in like lowercase t as, you know, the experience that a lot of teachers have every day. And I think grief, we really only recognize it as speaking to death, and not just any old death. Whereas grieving, you can grieve so many things, and the characters in this book grieve transitions. The title of the book actually comes from something that my therapist said to me about grieving, and he was speaking about death, well, possibly literally, possibly metaphorically. He said, "Listen, here's the thing about death. There are always two deaths. There's the actual literal death when the event occurs, either the loved one dies, or the relationship ends, or the job ends. Whatever dies, dies. And then eventually, maybe in a matter of weeks or months or even years, the reality of that death will hit you one day. You will come to accept that it has occurred, because it doesn't have you're unable to process it that quickly. And the space in between, you are existing in the space between two deaths. I knew that space most intimately at the time as the space between the actual death of a parent and then the acknowledgement that had taken place. Though it was a time of great transition for me, so there were a lot of things dying, right? Like the family unit I had died, and I had that death, and then I had the acknowledgement of that death, and I was traveling in the space in between it. Now I had to do a little bit of tap dancing in the plot to make the title work with things that actually happen to people. But I share all that to really emphasize the fact that I was grieving a lot of change. And I kind of look back and say, without grieving, you know, I kind of think the word processing is a little bit gross, but without grieving, we can't really appreciate what has happened and where we find ourselves. And these characters are moving through their lives very quickly, change is occurring very quickly, but they are also grieving that which they've left behind, the possibilities which no longer exist, the people they thought they knew, or the people they thought they were, who they are not, or who they do not know. So it's like a dozen different flavors of grieving, with the hope that something that a reader can latch onto something, that something will hit a certain frequency, and a reader could say, like, that, thank you, yes, that is recognizable to me. And in being recognizable to me, that allows me to feel less alone with it. That'd be nice. I'll believe that.
Sam wants to know the dog's name, the talking dog's name.
It's like I wrote it for you, Sam. The talking dog name is Ren. Ren the talking dog.
All right.
I mean, you don't know he talks until like really deep in the book. I'm trusting you guys will forget all about this by the time that book is published.
And they'll be like, wait a minute, didn't you mention that talking dog once?
I'm so glad I went to his launch.
Juliet Sweet has a question. Do you find that it is particularly potent being an artist at this time when hope for the future of the world, for humankind's place in it, for any end to the ever-widening chasm among various fractious groups seems to be flickering in the minds of so many, especially young people?
We're going to be okay. We're going to be all right. Someone, I don't know if it was the person I was talking to conceived of this or if they were just repeating something to me, but somebody once described artists as shrimp, just kind of like filtering through the water. I think there's a weird, first of all, it takes a tremendous amount of balls to call yourself an artist. But once you have, I think there is a really heavy burden that you carry trying to either capture a moment in time or create something that is of use or at the very least is beautiful. Not everyone produces work that quickly. I happen to write really quickly, but better writers and painters and singers and whatnot take, years to create things. And by the time they've created it, I'm sure they say to themselves, Jesus, who even cares anymore? But I think there is just no questioning or denying the necessity of it all. So the best thing you could do is really just put on blinders and create as much, I would say as fast, but even that applies unnecessary pressure as possible. And just recognize that being alive and being aware, we are all, I use that word, processing. We're all chewing on kind of this, gnawing on this shared reality. And artists just try to monetize it and fail terribly, but just keep trying. It's capitalism. A little heart from poopy head.
I was just thinking about what you were saying before about the space between two deaths and that question. Who knows, like 5 years from now, there could be people, it's just the right time to read a book that reflects back on the pandemic and what that meant. They could be just ready to process it, chew on it more than, sorry, didn't mean to use the word process. So,
I had a really unique experience. In the book that's being shot now, there are a lot of little parables, little kind of like, I can't even call them myths. And I would punch them out. And as I was writing this book and writing these parables, it was the earliest stages of the pandemic and the quarantine when I was writing it. And then we had really kind of settled into it last summer when I was putting the finishing touches on this book. And I thought, I have the capacity and I have the vehicle here to write a parable for what is happening right now. I can write a parable that's 1.5 pages long called The Quarantine. And I can capture this moment in time. I have to, how would I do that? How would I do that? And it was actually, it's a bad summer. The same summer, Australia was on fire. All of Australia was on fire. And I was like, hey, I can write a parable. Again, like a 1.5 pages, 1.25 pages, specifically about the behavior that leads to something like this. And a part of me says, like, do I have the balls? And then another part of me says, it's cool, man. No, we're going to read this, like, go for it. Like, deal with that problem once you get to it. So I did actually write a parable called The Quarantine. And I did write a parable called The Fire. And I did put them into this book. And I think that they fit in where they are. And is there like a grubby little part of me that thinks, I hope an editor really likes that and wants to buy that? Well, sure, man. Like, of course there is. I wouldn't do it if I didn't think if I thought it was going to kill the book. But it was actually, it's the closest I've ever come to what I imagine. It's just my imagination, but like what I imagine a stand-up comic, like walking onto stage, having just heard something that day, being like, I heard something crazy today. This just blows my mind. And then riffing on it and maybe getting no laughs, but they're just, they're the filter or they're the lens for what has just occurred. Novelists don't get to be that very often. So I was glad that I had the chance to do it. You didn't even ask a question and I gave you an answer. I'm rolling now.
Does anybody have any other statements or questions that Jamie can answer?
Opinions even. No, that's wrong.
Just blink if you want Jamie to riff on it.
Any kind of sensory input whatsoever.
All right. We may be at the natural end of this evening.
I'm prepared to accept that.
Okay. I'm pasting into the chat once more the link to the event where Jamie's wonderful book is for sale. We would, again, really appreciate it if you bought it from Annie Blooms. That'd be great. Thank you, everyone. And Jamie, I can't recall if we talked about you're happy to come into the store and sell and sign some books that have sold, I think.
Yeah, you said something about me doing it in the basement, which was, borderline creepy, but I'm still down. It didn't turn me off all the way. So yes, I would love to come sign some copies of the book.
It's the business part of Annie Blooms. It's not, like a
Don't try to make it okay.
seller that we throw you.
Don't just let it float by you and just keep going.
Cool. So yeah, feel free to purchase a book from Annie Blooms, and then we will lock Jamie in a cellar and force him to sign it for you.
Thank you for just being your genuine self. I dig that.
Thank you everyone so much for coming out tonight. It was really great to see you all, and congratulations, Jamie. Happy book birthday. Awesome. Thanks again. This, as Jamie said, this is going to be recorded. It is being recorded right now, and tomorrow afternoon sometime probably I will put it up on our YouTube channel, so you can go and watch it again or share it with friends or tell people about it. That'd be great. Thanks so much, and hope to see you at another event. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.